for joining the Broadway Drumming 101 podcast with your host, Clayton Craddock.
Born and raised in Binghamton, New York, Ron Tierno began studying drums at the age of 9 years old. He later moved to New York City, and an audition for Frankie Valli in 1978 led to a national tour to support his huge hit single, Grease. Numerous recordings and jingles followed, and he later began subbing on Broadway in 1980. Ron later worked on several other shows and eventually was hired to do the first national tour of Cats in 1984. He was subsequently hired for the Broadway production in 1989. Some of the Broadway shows that he's worked on include The Pirate Queen, Oklahoma, The Little Mermaid, Gypsy, Mamma Mia, A Chorus Line, Barnum, Cats, Late Night Comic, Romance, Song and Dance, Cage Aux Folles, and Dr. Zhivago. Ladies and gentlemen, Ron Tierno. Welcome to Broadway Drumming 101. My name is Clayton Craddock, and my guest today is Ron Tierno. Thank you for coming on my show. I was looking forward to talking to you because your name has been popping up in other conversations I've had with people like Paul Pizzuti and Michael Keller, and I'm like, man, you know what? I need to reach out to this guy. So I'm glad you're here. I want to find out so much about you because you've been around for a long time, and I'm sure you can teach me a lot. So thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, Clayton. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here, and let's see where this goes.
So you were born in Binghamton, New York.
Correct.
And what brought you to New York City?
Well, as a kid, and because it's not that far away, my family would come to New York a fairly regular basis. Matter of fact, some of my first memories of seeing music would be, believe it or not, I used to see Gene Krupa at the Metropole, which is still there. That marquee is still there. But Gene Krupa used to play in the afternoon at like 5 o'clock, which is how I could get to go in with my dad, and see this, at that point, very old, tired-looking drummer. And one of the reasons maybe was he was playing from 5 till like 2 in the morning. And he used to alternate with like a show band and all sorts of interesting stuff. Cozy Cole was there a lot, and but it was sort of like and I don't even remember what year this would be, so it had to be the late 50s. And then also we would, every Christmas time, we'd go to see the Radio City Christmas show. So that was always a real treat. Ironically, when I first came to New York, not right away, but it was like an emergency situation. I didn't know anybody at Radio City, but I got a call to come in and sub on the show. They needed a drummer, and I came in, and the contractor was the percussionist. His name was Bob Swan, and he talked me through the book, and we played the show. So it was such a crazy thing, because when the orchestra came up out of the pit, I remember a series of chords it started with as the pit is rising up, just these whole note chords. We weren't playing yet, but somebody's doing that. And I'm looking out in the audience, and I saw myself out there as a kid, and that's when it hit me that, like, wow, this is New York, and I'm here. And we got through the show. I mean, it didn't stop, so it couldn't have been that bad. And I did a couple of them, but the music in those days too was much easier to do that. You didn't have the advantage of having a video cam or a recording of the music, and probably the old timers would just sight read shows. There was no requirement to watch and whatnot. And maybe later on there was, but that was my first experience. But other than that, I'd never seen a Broadway show. So when John Redsecker called me to sub on Barnum, that was the first Broadway show I had done. I'd never seen a Broadway show. So again, I'm thinking back as to, you'd ask how did I get started in this, and how many of us actually planned on doing this. My experience with Broadway was my parents playing the original cast album to My Fair Lady and The King and I. So as a young drummer, that is not making me aspire to want to play a Broadway show, right?
Well, let me ask you, what you listening to those cast albums? I don't. Some people now might say, "Oh my God, this is the greatest thing ever. I want to play Broadway." But this is, I guess, you grew up in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah. More of a, I'm more musically aware of the 60s, but I definitely, those are my first memories of music, was inheriting my brother and sister's record collection. So it was like the 50s rock and like, Bill Haley and the Comets and Little Richard and Chuck Berry. And then my brother was into Dave Brubeck. So one of my first drumming inspirations was Joe Morello from Take Five. So my listening to the Broadway shows is as a child. So it's not, I wasn't even thinking about being a drummer yet. You know what I mean? So I just didn't listen to it from a musical standpoint or a drumming standpoint. I just know I could hum the tunes, but it wasn't something coming home from school I would, share with my friends.
Was the Beatles on Ed Sullivan a turning point for you as well?
Absolutely. Yep. It, yes, I remember actually watching the show. I remember seeing on the news them getting off the plane and about this band, coming from England and all this screaming and everything. So I watched it. But musically, let's see, I was already taking lessons about that time. Musically, it didn't grab me yet. The excitement did, but it didn't make me want to go out and, start a Beatle band, because again, I grew up listening to, Joe Morello. My drum teacher was more jazz inspired. He was a Philly Joe guy, and Max Roach. And in upstate New York, in Binghamton, Buddy Rich would come through town every couple months. Whenever there was a tour, they'd go. He was doing, bus tours, and they'd go from city to city. So they probably go, New York, Binghamton, Rochester, Syracuse, and on out to the Midwest. And he came through frequently. So as I played more and more, when you see Buddy Rich, they said when he passed, there'd never be anyone else like him, and that's certainly the case. Now, musically, I certainly grew from that, and I didn't try to play like Buddy Rich, but from a drumming standpoint, watching Ringo Starr play didn't, again, excite me to play like that. It's even those old 50s rock records. If you look at those drummers and you look at their sets, they're playing old jazz kits. They're playing their ride pattern, even if it's a fast eighth note thing. They're playing on the ride cymbal, and they're playing their hi-hat foot on 2 and 4. They weren't playing matched grip and playing on the hi-hat, So even now when I teach kids, I try to teach them to use all 4 limbs right away, because if you start riding on the hi-hat, you don't use your left foot, it makes it much harder to add it in later on.
So you started taking lessons in Binghamton at 10?
Actually 9. Yep. I was thinking back now to when all this started, and I spoke to my sister recently, and I said, didn't you buy me bongos for Christmas when I was 8? And that sort of started it, because I think I must have liked them. And I looked at my save. I'm a saver of everything. So I have my first notebooks and all the books I studied out of. And my first lesson was in 1961. So I still have that stuff. And it's fun to look back on and think about how'd you start, because sometimes kids might bug their parents to take lessons. Sometimes the parents, and I'm seeing this now because I'm teaching a lot of young kids. Sometimes they want to come to you. And I think now it's even harder to get kids to be inspired musically, just like I was. Again, the British invasion was, I think it created a whole generation of love for music writing your own tunes. And I certainly, we didn't even talk about that part, but I was certainly into all that as I grew up and had the hair and everything. It was terrific.
Oh, really?
But, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Did you have a drum set like Ringo Starr? Like, what was your drum set in the 60s?
I did have a Ludwig kit that was the Ringo Starr kit for a while. And then I graduated to the Buddy Rich Rogers setup, which I kept for many years. In those days, it seems like nowadays you can start with an electronic kit, or you can buy a kid student model drum set very inexpensively, the full kit. And that was not the case when I was coming up. So my parents did it in the way that seems reasonable in hindsight. Start with a snare drum, and then they got me a bass drum, a used bass drum, and then a ride cymbal, and then a hi-hat, and then I think I even got a separate mismatched floor tom. And then we traded that all in for that first Ludwig kit, so that's early mid 60s.
Did you play in a lot of bands, or was it
absolutely? Yep.
Rock bands, jazz bands?
Yeah, no, rock bands. I played some jazz in school and some. There was a cultural center up there called the Robertson Arts, and they had jazz programs that my teacher encouraged me to sign up for. So I had a good taste of that early on. As a matter of fact, from a historical perspective, the woman, the pianist who ran that, her name was Claire Wood, wound up marrying Slam Stewart, the bass player. And Slam, when he retired, moved to Binghamton and was involved in that Roberson Center. And we later on, as I had a little jazz group that we played at Roberson, just before I was ready to come to New York, he was very complimentary to me, and he wrote me a nice letter of recommendation. And he was a beautiful guy. But what a person to see play live when I'd never heard of someone that sang along with their bass playing like that, and to hear it live, it was like, again, it was one of those mesmerizing moments, like when the first time you see your drum hero, is to see a bass player take a solo, and you can't tell where the voice separates from the bass. It was just one. It was so pure and a beautiful sound.
Did you choose to go to a music school after high school?
No, I did not. I went on the music school of the road. I was gonna go to Berklee. I was all set to do that, and a show band was coming through Binghamton that had a 6-night-a-week gig in Washington, D.C. And it was like, this is like Chicago, Blood, Sweat, and Tears. There were a lot of horn bands this is like 1970, and I had just gotten out of high school. So I also had draft issues to deal with, so I was waiting to see what was going to happen. Yikes. So this road gig came up, and I got to move to Washington at 18 or 19 years old with my own apartment, bought a car cash, had a gig 6 nights a week, and it was a pretty sweet start. So then I came back to Binghamton for a while, and lots of other things happened along the way, but I kept putting off going to school, and I figured, well, let me try New York first, and we'll see how it goes, and then I'll go. I figured it's always there if I need it. And I just didn't do it. I still want to go now, actually, but because I realized, I should have learned this, I should have learned that, but no, I did not go to music school.
So, not going to music school, did you teach at any music schools at all? Like, did you have you been able to teach any courses?
I studied with my teacher in Binghamton, Tony. I studied with him privately for 10 years. SUNY Binghamton, which is now is a great school, a state school. At that time, it was a very small school, didn't have much of a music program. And in high school, I used to sub into their ensembles when they needed extra percussionists. And I taught for my teacher, Tony Monfort, as a student teacher. And when I came to New York, I studied with Sam Milano and Bernard Purdy, and I did a couple drum classes that came up as opportunities. So I always liked the idea of teaching. A little later, when I was on the road, I did a couple seminars I did one at Berklee and New England Conservatory on drum machines at the beginning of that era. So I don't know if that's a whole nother thing to talk about, but when I was really after I'd had some success with Frankie Valli and traveling and recording, and then starting to dip my toes into Broadway, actually before the deep dip of my toes into Broadway, I was really thinking that, oh my God, it's over for us, because electronics are coming, and this drum machine thing is going to put us all out of work. And someone said, well, why don't you get one and you learn to program it, and you be the one, because you would know how to program it better than anybody. So that's a good idea. So I bought a Linn drum. I bought an Oberheim DMX, was a competing machine. And what I had done, and this was at the same time I went out with Cats. So I was, now looking at Broadway as the future. But at the same time, I had these drum machines. I wrote a couple of duets for drum machine and drum set. And I did those as a clinic when I was on the road with these shows, because I was playing with the teachers and professors at all these music schools. We're always in the pit bands on the road because they would hire locally. So that's how I met them, and that was a good introduction into that stream. But it's funny because when I came back from a year and a half of Cats on the road, and I came back to town, and I figured, okay, so now I'll get back into recording and we'll get things rolling again. And the drum machines had changed already. The keyboard players were onto new things, and they were doing all the programming, and my stuff was obsolete. Linn drum, matter of fact, they came out with a follow-up machine. It's called the Linn 9000. And it bombed because it went from the Linn drum of being $2,500 to like $5,000. And I never bought one, but I figured, geez, I didn't even pay off the first drum machine, and now we're moving on to this next thing. And Broadway started to really pop for me. The money was getting better, the work was getting better, the shows were getting more interesting. So I figured, well, from my standpoint, that's where the future was going to be, and that's how I really, went full bore into it.
Did you always try to maintain and stay ahead of what was coming next?
Well, I think the fact that I came to New York sort of very young, and I was very impressed with the whole city. It was a very, I didn't take it for granted, so to speak, and I wanted to make a living at music. And so because I was young, I hadn't settled down yet, but I thought, how can I possibly, support a family and raise kids playing drums, because I didn't come from a musical family that said, yeah, you can go do that. I came from, a working class Italian family where my father had his own business, and then he passed away actually when things were starting to go well for me. So, but he didn't have anything to pass on to me as far as a business. But when he passed, my grandfather sort of stepped in, and he's real old school Italian. And he said, you haven't saved enough money yet, come back here and get into business with your cousin. And, so I really felt that push to keep myself involved so that I could, see either a trend, or at least my way of doing it was by practicing, is, studying what was there, not just saying I could play it. I'd never turned down an opportunity to play or audition for anybody. And I look back now and I think of some of the people I called and, think I could do things, whereas now I'd really be nervous and, shed something, but more, but I think, when you're young, you're bold and you really stick it out there and do something. But I did try to at least be realistic to say, I have to be prepared for any of this. So I did it with hours of intensive practice, because I figured if I don't get it now, and again, I had gambled. I hadn't gone to music school. what else am I going to do? So this was as it turns out, now I look back and I'm very comfortable that I go, well, I guess I did okay. I'm not, rich or anything, but I'm satisfied. Whereas I remember being very tense and nervous as a kid because I was so driven, And ironically, I watched Paul Pizzuto's your thing with Paul, and he comes off exactly the way I always knew him, which was very relaxed and easygoing. And when you think of the things that a musical director would want from the band, or especially the drummer, because you have a very tight bond there, is someone who's fun to be around. Like Paul is like that. Warren Oates is like that. They're just joyful in the way they play. And I think it makes them more relaxed, and yet they're very confident in their skills. And that's something I look back and I feel I was pretty straight and too serious. I should have been a little more looser and relaxed in my approach. But the drive was the reason I was doing that.
So you moved to New York in the early 70s, correct?
Yes, 1974.
74. Now there was recording. There were, from what I just, talked to Michael Keller about, there were orchestras for CBS, ABC, and NBC. You had, Radio City. You had tours that came through, and you had Broadway. And you had clubs. I'm sure you probably did all of that.
A lot of choices. Did
you see Broadway as something that you wanted to do that was a higher priority than like session work?
No, especially not at the time, because again, my first show was 1980, and that was subbing, and that was Barnum. And I remember, I learned the book and I watched it and I came and played it and I got approved, and he gave me like 2 weeks in a row, and I thought I was going to die. He says, man, 8 shows a week. And then I looked at the check and I said, I could have made more playing a club date. So there was the first thing. Broadway was not high on the pay scale for musicians. It was not the priority gig. And the shows, when you think back, now Barnum was pretty cool because that's Cy Coleman, and he was a great writer. But until Weber, Andrew Lloyd Webber sort of broke through with that British invasion of Broadway that he fostered, that to me created the grounds of brought in a new audience, and it allowed for new ideas to inspire better productions. Because you still see it now, is that why would a producer take a chance on a new show that no one knows anything about when they can just remount a hit, and they figure they got a better shot of doing that. It's happened so many times. I've seen shows come around 2-3 times now. I say, why do they keep redoing that thing? But it's a big investment. And in 1980, I just wasn't paying attention to Broadway. And I have a feeling that until Cats came along, there weren't really the big blockbusters. Chorus Line was one. I know Chorus Line started in the mid 70s. Again, I saw a little snippet of it's on TV, but it didn't inspire me to want to go see it. Hair maybe is the first big rock musical that might have interested my generation and as far as a drummer. And I knew a lot of those songs. A bunch of bands played them, right? But no, it wasn't until I started doing Broadway that I enjoyed it more, and I understood the nuts and bolts of it.
So before you got to Broadway in 1978, you auditioned for Frankie Valli and you got the gig. You went out on a U.S. tour with him?
Yes. It was his first tour after the Four Seasons. So it was his first solo tour. I was invited to audition because of a referral from Charlie Colello, who was a hot producer in New York at that time. And what made Charlie Colello? I didn't know where he came from, other than he was calling me for jingles and recordings and stuff, and he was really hot. But he had done the arrangements for Swearing to God, And when you think of the transition from the old Four Seasons stuff to Swearing to God, you know, and that horn arrangement and everything, it was like he just brought Frankie into a whole nother area. So I think Frankie was trying to build on that with his solo career. And so I got that first shot at that. That was a real honor. And he was such a gentleman to work for. And he's still going, which is just, I can't get over that. He's still out there, you know, pretty amazing. What a career he's had.
Well, speaking of career, so Barnum in 1980 is the first Broadway show that you subbed on. And what was your first chair that you had on Broadway?
Let's see. I did a show in 1988 called Late Night Comic. It came and opened and closed pretty fast. So that's why I had to think about it and sort of look it up, because I'd forgotten about it. But your first show is always a lot of fun, you know. And then when the reviews are not great and it closes, you know, everyone's disappointed and, oh my goodness, you know, there's such a good show. Why didn't it go anywhere? But how many shows have done that? You know, how many times has that happened to us, or, you know, all musicians cumulatively? It's a tough thing to do. But it's not that show necessarily led to another show. But again, I was already on the circuit subbing, and that just happened to be my first chair. I did a show called Romance that was like a year later, and that started as an off-Broadway show in the Flower District in a loft, and it got picked up and went to the it used to be called the Ritz. It's a Broadway theater. It's on, I forgot what it's called now, and I forgot what's there. It's a small house, maybe a 500-seater, but Romance was there. Oh geez, was it at the Ritz? Maybe it wasn't even there. I'm sorry, maybe it wasn't even there. I'm mixing that up with Late Night Comic, you know. But anyway, Romance ran for about a year, surprisingly, and it was a fun little show. But certainly, you start to appreciate the Broadway family aspect of playing and doing something right from the ground floor all the way up. And it actually, you're waiting for the bad review, and it doesn't come, and then, you know. We had a Tony nomination, didn't win anything, but you know, it was a sparse year that year, so it got nominated for things that it might not have against the bigger shows in a different year. So I think that helped us run a little longer as well.
So you were subbing at Cats at that time, well, after that closed, correct?
Well, before that time, I was subbing at Cats. So yeah, Paul called me. It opened in the end of '82. And so I probably started there in, 83 subbing. And then I did the first national of Cats in end of 1983 or 1984. And I was out with that for about a year and a half. So again, this is what I was talking about earlier about the changing of the guard of Broadway. I mean, Cats had 4 national touring companies at one time going on, you know, in addition to Broadway. It was just mammoth. And so after I did the national for a little over a year, I came back and I would go out and sub on all the other companies to give those drummers vacation breaks, because they were all running like, you know, full bore, you know, just incredible.
You were saying how much of a phenomenon it was when you eventually wound up getting the gig when Paul left. You had it for how many years? 7, 12?
11.
11. That's incredible. First of all, how did you keep your sanity after 2 or 3 years? Because I know Paul said, you know, I'll do it for a couple of years, but he wound up, you know, staying for 5. Yeah. But you stayed for 11, something like that. I can't remember how long he stayed, but
18 years total. So yeah, he left in the 8th year or the 9th. Yeah, about the 8th year. Yeah.
Yeah, he said he's going to stop at 5, and then he stayed until 7.
More, yeah.
So how did you maintain your sanity and keep it fresh?
Okay, well, that's a good question, and that's the obvious question anyone would ask of someone doing a long running show. So I've answered it many times and thought about it, because I'm going, I don't know, it never bothered me. And this is coming from someone who was complaining about doing 2 weeks at Barnum, and and I'm getting, and here I'm doing something for 11 years. How did I manage that? I think part of it was, it was not on click. You had a different orchestra every night, basically. You never knew who was going to be coming in. It was so comfortable. There was rarely someone really knew that. Well, no, you'd always have a new sub, I suppose, but it just sort of, so many people played in and out of it. So it was very, you had to be aware of the differences whether from the brass section or the reeds, and make those adjustments to that. And then note because we were backstage, note if there was a frustration in the conductor because of something going on stage, and we had to make adjustments. You got to be ready for that. So it's not like, in the way the shows are so programmed perfectly, and everything is so, digitally perfect nowadays. The only thing that stops a show is a electronic crash of some sort, right? Whereas here, you went on, you managed, you know what I mean? And if someone, if a horn breaks, someone else jumps in and covers that part, or if your bass drum pedal folds, and you just got to get through until you have time to change it. So I don't know. I just felt the freshness, I think, came in is that there was no dialogue in the show. There was maybe one segment where at the beginning of a song, there's a speaking part that lasts literally, 10 or 15 seconds. Other than that, it's music from wall to wall. So I think the hardest part would be waiting for the show to start. Like that, oh God, I'm here, let's go, when I'm gonna start. But man, once that downbeat came, you go into the world, you go into the zone, and it just sort of played itself. It was very easy, relaxing to play from, again, from all that time. But I didn't feel, I'm sure I did, but I blocked it out as far as any boredom or any of that. And again, I would sub out when I felt that, for instance, I stopped reading the book or using the book. I was inspired by the bass player who was doing working on technical things while he was playing. I'm saying, how is he doing that? So I was that was a challenge. Was can I close the book? Again, these are things you wouldn't do now, but back then, you did things to keep yourself into it and involved. What I found would happen is if I played maybe 2 weeks of shows straight without taking a show off, I'd have a little mental glitch. I'd forget something, some little thing. Or was that the first time we did that or the second time? And then I realized, okay, I got to take a day off, So it was those kinds of things that I forced myself to take a break. Not that I wasn't subbing out when I had other gigs and stuff, but it was just stream of consciousness. You're just living your life. And if you say, how could you do that for 11 years? Well, hey, we live long lives, and you get up every day and you do routines. It was part of my routine. That's all.
Fascinating, man. I think you went into the heavy side layer when you were.
Yeah. Perfect. You did know the show.
I tried to get there, man. I tried, but
that's the aspiration. There you go.
But I tell you what, the longest running show I had was almost 3 years, and I never got tired of it. I loved every minute of it. First of all, because I was getting paid very well and getting health insurance and a pension, get to play drums for a living. I'm working with great musicians, and I get to play in front of an audience every night.
Yep. That's thrilling. That's what we do. Now, if you don't like the show, or if you hate it, or if there is stress in the pit, then it's a little different. That can make things painful and make it hard to come to work. I've seen people with that kind of an attitude, or for whatever reasons, if it's personal, or I've seen two chairs where you're supposed to be in a section and everyone's supposed to be, facing the conductor. And two guys hated each other so much they would turn their chairs away so that they wouldn't have to look at the person next to them. And there's,
Yikes.
And I felt glad I wasn't in a situation where, I was dealing with anybody like that.
Yeah. Ooh. So after Cats, when you got the 7:00 meeting on stage, company meeting, 7:00, you're like, oh man, did you see the end of Cats coming?
We talked about it regularly. I think the old timers who felt, this is it for me. And, they'd watch the numbers, the Broadway gross numbers. I didn't think of it, I think, quite so much in those terms. Plus, when you get into, 10 years at it, it's going to stop. So, and I still felt I was young enough that I could get back out there and do other things. And the day that it happened, it was the company manager jumped on the podium at the end of the show, because usually everyone runs out in 2 seconds. And he realized, if I'm not right there when the show ends, everyone's going to run out. And I want to tell them. So literally the conductor, downbeat, da-da, and jumps off. And ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you something, because when you leave the theater, there's going to be a lot of press people outside, but I just want to let you know that the show is going to be closing on X and X date. Thank you very much.
Oh, wow.
So it wasn't even like walking into the show the next day and seeing the notice posted on the board, which is the way most people learn about it, right? It was literally after now it didn't, they were announcing the closing. We still had a few months to go, quite a few months as a matter of fact.
Okay.
But he just wanted us to know, so we didn't get caught off guard when we left the theater.
Okay.
So there it was. And there was silence in the pit. Nobody cheered. Nobody cried. It was just silence. We just all sort of got up and went on our way, and then let it sink in.
Was it a stunned silence, or was it a just,
I think it was a stunned silence. Yeah. Plus, no one ever jumps up on the podium at the end of the show to make some sort of an emergency announcement, or this is a fire drill, leave the theater immediately. This was, news flash, so whoa, okay.
After Cats closed, then what did you do?
Okay, so then I before Cats, I wasn't subbing on a ton of shows here and there, and I was still, had other jobs going on and gigs that I was pursuing. So once Cats closed, I realized, okay, now I'm sort of starting over. This is like going into the twilight zone and then coming out a generation later, and like, okay, wow, I got to go back out in the real world. The good thing was, and here was the camaraderie of the business, is that I think anybody that subbed for me during the run, or even just came to watch the show, and I don't know, maybe I was nice to them or something, everybody called me to sub on their shows. So I literally had 5 shows going fairly soon as subs after that, thanks to that, generosity of payback. And then, of course, I realized, well, this is the way Broadway really works now, because every one of them was totally diverse, and you have to do a lot of homework, and you got to be prepared. So I felt it was my welcome to the modern age of Broadway that and then you have been dealing with now.
Did you get another show shortly after subbing around, or?
Not shortly after. I did a couple, and again, things that didn't run. I did a revival of La Cage in 2005, and then Dr. Zhivago in 2015. That was another one that, it was a big budget show, and it, opened and closed very quickly. Yeah. Did you even know it was a Broadway show? Or?
No.
Yeah, that's how fast it came and went.
2015? That was like recently.
2015. Yeah.
Damn.
Yeah, it was at the Broadway Theater.
As far as your longevity in the business, what do you attribute that to?
That's hard, because I'd want to say it's because I was really helpful to the conductor, and I was really easy to work with. I tried to do that, but I look back and I look back and I sometimes say I could have done that better. You know, I from what I see now, the way drummers approach it, because like I said, it was just a gig that came up and you'd learn the book and you'd go in, but the homework and the amount of involvement that drummers take in the show now, it seems to be much deeper. And I didn't get that until a little bit later. You know what I mean? And I don't know if that's a historical perspective or if it's that I really didn't want to do Broadway shows. And, you know, as I got older, maybe then I go, oh, well, now I do. And I realized the amount of work. I just didn't have the love, the passion that maybe people are coming with now. And I'll say this too, is that I if they are coming with passion to play on Broadway as a drummer, it's because of the shows. You know, I mean, Ain't Too Proud, I would have loved to play on them. You know, those tunes and everything, that must have been a ball. Hamilton. I mean, there's just a lot of new things. I look and I go, oh man, that would inspire me if I were a young person coming up to want to play those things, because they're drumistic and they're a lot of fun. Where if you're, like I said, if you're thinking Broadway's My Fair Lady in Oklahoma and stuff, I would play some of these tunes and I go, man, it's just a show too. And that's, what's the big deal? This isn't fun. I didn't, practice and study and be inspired by these great drummers to play this, because if I played what I was inspired with, if I'm doing my Tony Williams licks in Oklahoma, I won't be working. Right. So that's the other thing, is you got to have that musical outlet to play and do what's right for the show. I guess that's what it would be, is that I still felt I'm going to put a little of myself in here. You know what I've been working on this little GAD thing I got. I'm going to put that in there. Shouldn't have done that in certain situations, because musically that wasn't right. You got to do, as a sub, you got to do it the way the chair does it. And you got to make sure that musically fits. So I think, again, that's an area where I would be a little more respectful of the craft,
If you were talking to a bunch of young drummers, which you're actually doing right now on this podcast, what advice would you give to a young drummer / percussionist starting out in the business today?
If you like what you hear on the show, subscribe to the Broadway Drumming 101 newsletter at broadwaydrumming101.substack.com. That's Substack, substack.com. The Broadway Drumming 101 newsletter is your one-stop shop for everything you'll need to know about playing drums for Broadway musicals. When you subscribe to the newsletter, you'll learn about what it takes to be a successful pit musician, with content delivered directly to your email inbox 2 to 3 times a week. For $5 a month or $50 a year, you'll have a backstage pass to the world of a Broadway drummer playing on a hit show. As a paying subscriber, you'll receive behind-the-scenes access to the life of a musician who makes a living on Broadway. You'll also be able to read every post, not just those occasional free ones. You'll get access to all newsletter issues in the archives and have an ability to participate in subscriber-only comments and events. If you become a founding member for a gift of only $75, you'll receive discounted private drum lessons and a 25% discount on future promotional products. If you'd like to make a direct contribution to the production of this show, you can reach us at Venmo at Clayton-Craddock, Cash App at Syncopated, that's CINCOPATED, or PayPal at Clayton Craddock. Any amount of support will be appreciated. Thank you for listening.
If you were talking to a bunch of young drummers, which you're actually doing right now on this podcast, what advice would you give to a young drummer / percussionist starting out in the business today?
Let me think about this, because there's a lot of obvious things, that we probably heard. I mean, so again, I've given this some thought, but you obviously have to be super prepared. So we've already said that, right? But the ability to come in new to something with your eyes and ears totally open because you're prepared. I mean, you know that old situation where if your head is in the book too much, there's one of the big complaints, you know, because you'll ask, well, how did my sub do? Well, you know, he or she didn't get a head out of the book and they weren't watching me enough. Again, a good young drummer especially is going to know the importance of that communication with the conductor. Secondly, I would say use your peer group to make friends, not just with other drummers, because you'll get some subbing situations, but you know, probably the most important person when you come out of music school is someone who's writing stuff or is aspiring to be a musical director. That's the person you want to be. You want them to think of you when they're going to do some sort of a workshop. It's not paying any money, and I don't know where this is going to go. But man, if you do that to the right person and you put your trust in them to say, "Okay, I'm with you. What do you want me to do?" Well, it's this style. It might be this or that, and then boom, you never know what you have, you know, next from that. I mean, it could be, you know, the next. I remember hearing a story about that with Jeff Potter about Rent, you know, and I'm sure there's a lot of shows like that where, you know, you didn't realize that this thing is just going to explode. And if you're there at the beginning and you're the right one that was willing to hang with them, then you reap the benefits.
What would you tell someone that is starting to sub what it's like to receive notes and what it means to just tell me about your note receiving experience.
Okay, very, very good. Yep. I mean, a whole bunch of situations are running through my head because there are some MDs who you could have played an awful show and felt bad about yourself, and they were so supportive and nice in their notes. And there could be other conductors who, one in particular, who wrote down during the show, every time I messed up a little something, I'd see him going for his pen and he'd be writing this down. And I got 2 pages of notes that were bordering on, I don't want to say abusive, but I was just so assaulted. I felt did you have to go that far in your nastiness about the way I played this one thing, you know? So, and so the way I took that, because I wasn't fired, I was, you know, I first of all is you get a good night's sleep. Let that roll off. Do not let it end your career. So it took me a little while to get, you know, take a few deep breaths and say, okay, I'm coming back in for another date, and I'm going to take those notes and I'm going to work on it and let's see what happens. And the next time it was better, you know, and the time after that it was better. I mean, it was kind of a show. It didn't really become easy all the way. It was a tricky show. So that's the other thing, is that to persevere through that. I remember one drummer who was asking me to sub. I was referred to him, and another fairly difficult show. And his opening line to me is, "Now this is really going to take a lot of work." And he says, if you don't think you can handle it, don't waste my time. Okay, are you gonna accept that challenge or not? I accepted the challenge. Okay, I'm going in there. So you got to have that kind of attitude. You got to be strong of will. And if you come to the game prepared, you know you can play your instrument, then these are just the little dings that you just got to sort of get over. And, you know, oh, okay, I didn't realize that. I think the biggest thing that it's really hard to prepare for, and maybe you can hit me as to what you do in a new show to prepare for this, but understanding the dynamics that are different, you know, because we all play differently. And we're talking acoustic drums now. So I'm trying to look at the drummer and thinking now, how hard or light is that person playing? Because I got to sort of be like them, you know? So that to me is always a difficult thing, because I know if you play too loud, They don't like it, even if it's just the musicians around you, you know? So you can create a lot of enemies in a pit if you do that when you think you're doing a great job.
My first Broadway show was actually on stage, and there was a plexiglass in front of me, and it was mic'd. So it was a little bit different. And actually, Lady Day was on stage, but Ain't Too Proud was in a booth. So I didn't have to worry about playing too hard or too soft. Of course, you had to play at a certain level because you still have to satisfy the sound man or sound woman who's out there mixing the show. Because if you play too loud, they know that you're playing too loud, especially when a sub comes in. They might be a basher and they may play too loud. But I want to go back to when you first started in the 80s. Like a show like Aladdin, when I watched John Redsecker play Aladdin, his drums are mic'd, but they're still in the pit. From your experience of playing back then, knowing how to play at a certain dynamic level, I guess that's something that you had to basically concentrate on very specifically since you were in a pit. Did you see a progression from that kind of setting to now where you're playing in pits, and how did you adjust to that?
Well, I think now that there are more rock shows. So again, I came from an era where the sound people weren't used to mixing rock shows, and they weren't used to putting plexiglass up, and they weren't, there was an orchestra in a pit, and the reason you were in a pit that was open was so that sound would get out. And as the sound got better and the sound design, they spent more money on it, and body mics came into play for the stage. The level of mixing the sound of the band was more and more important. So you didn't have to hit a cymbal crash so loud so that they could hear it at the back of the house, because it was going to be mic'd. Or if it was a loud section, they could bring it up or bring it down. But you're still, if it's an acoustic situation, you have to think about what you can control in the pit. And then your notes would come from the soundboard to the conductor. And I even know shows, this is maybe more common now, but the conductor would always tell the sound person who's playing certain key chairs where there's volume differences. Not necessarily good or bad, but just they probably had their markings. Okay, Tierno's in. Okay, we better do this to the on this number or whatever. So, but I think in the modern shows they prepare for that better, And my first experience of that, to where I was really comfortable with it, was Mamma Mia, where you're in an enclosed booth designed for that. The ABBA musicians wanted a full out rock sound. Hit the drums as hard as you can hit them, and it was very freeing in that sense, because you could play it to get that authentic rock sound. And if you got a big fat backbeat and a splashy hi-hat, you could hit it as comfortable as you felt without really offending anyone. So that was fun to always play that show for that reason. And I think modern shows that's sort of in the writing, in the design now. They take that all into account, which I'm actually happy for, because if you're doing a rock-oriented show and they want you to play as if you're in a string quartet volume, it's not going to have the impact. And there are times where there's a case of it's drum set and strings, and it's all open. And if it's a rock tune, well, how can I can't get a sound, if I'm going to drown out the strings or it's going to bleed. But I think that, again, in the sound design now, it's much more taken into account. And when I do see shows, I don't see a lot of shows that often, but the sound is just spectacular out in the house. And I don't think that was the case on shows when I was doing them early. As a matter of fact, if anything, if I would take a show off at Katz and go out in the house and watch it, I was disappointed. I thought, we're thinking about all this little minutia back there, and it's not, you don't even notice it.
Have you recorded many cast albums?
No, just a couple. And okay, so that brings up another story. I don't know where you're going to go with that, but the cast albums I did them, the way you did them, you played the show, just run it top to bottom because they only had so much money, and it was very little in the way of worrying about what the drums sounded like, and let's just get through it, and then put a lot of reverb on it when we're mixing it so no one can hear all the little stuff anyway.
And the vocals are way high and the music is way down. When I go see certain shows, I feel that they mix the vocals really hot and the band really low. And you, like you said, you're wondering why you're doing all this stuff. I played a triangle in that part. I don't even hear it out there. But for the shows that I've done recently, I've been very pleasantly surprised at the way it sounds. Like you said, modern shows today, they have speakers everywhere and subs and speakers in front. It's like a rock show. Sometimes it's too loud. Maybe I'm just getting old. Like I saw a show recently. I'm like, oh my God, it's so loud. But that, it was a rock show. But in any event, there are a lot of musicians that don't see the shows that they play in because when they see it from the audience, they don't hear that guitar thing that they're doing or that string thing, and they get disappointed. But it's a lot better now. But doing a bunch of shows, just curious as to what you found to be the most difficult show you've ever played.
Well, I would say that's Lion King. A lot of fun to play, but stressful. And this is in the original version with Tom Iago, and is at the New Amsterdam. So I'm maybe things have changed now. But first of all, he's very tall. I'm not that tall, and one of the things you do as a sub is not make too many adjustments to anybody's setup. So, I could barely reach the bass drum on his setup that he had, and the way he wanted a real studio sound. So he was using those GK headphones where everything is really super, super isolated. And yet I'm hitting these drums for the first time. I can't tell if am I playing too loud? Am I not playing loud enough? I don't think they had Aviom like presets on the mixes back then. I could adjust, but I could only adjust as I'm sort of playing. So I don't know that we could save it so that the next time I came in, I could get the same thing. So just a physical setup. And even though you're sort of in front of the conductor, he was like, 8 feet up, like right here. So you're playing like this, you're looking straight up. So it was a little uncomfortable on my neck. My legs weren't comfortable. And then he had these very cool tom-toms. I don't even know what the name of them. I don't know what brand it was, but they were like a tacked head on the top. So it was sort of like a hand drum. And I don't know if that was custom or someone puts them out. It's not like a wood rim tom, but tacked over the edge and very tight. So I guess it's to give you a hand drum quality because there's so much organic stuff going on in that show. But ironically, if you're not used to playing and you're playing a lot of toms there, the spring is something you're not used to feeling. So your first few times playing that show, you're playing these tom-toms as if it feels like a snare drum, the way the sticks are popping off, and it really does fluster you in addition to all these other things going on, So I would say that was the most difficult show. A lot of fun to play, certainly, drumistically, but again, not on click and very organic, great band that they were playing all over there was so much going on, with them. So depending who was in, they took a lot of liberties. Tommy took a lot of liberties at the time. And do I take those liberties or do I not? Do I play it the way he played it the last time or, so you got to find your place as a sub, but in this case, not necessarily feel you got to show them all your shit and try to play like Tom Iago if that's not the way you play. And just, hope they like it and hope it works. So there are challenging shows like that where you sort of have to pace yourself as to how you're going to approach it. And that's why it was tricky.
Speaking of going into sub, especially for someone who's very tall, or maybe someone shorter than you, and they have their drums set up differently. It's different from you having your own show where you can set your own drums up. But sometimes you can run into problems where you might play differently, and it might affect your limbs. And the reason why I bring that up is because after playing a show for 11 years at Cats, you need to set up your drums in a way that's not going to cause you any long-term physical pain. How did you go about avoiding that, doing the same thing every night, avoiding carpal tunnel or tendonitis or any other kind of drumming injury?
Well, that is a great question, because I had one incident where I had a pain in my wrist. No, it didn't develop into I've had a ganglion cyst before in my wrist, and that was not from the stresses of playing a repetitive show. It was from something different. I think carrying a cymbal bag in my hand or something, where literally you get this little bump and they say, oh, it's just a ganglion cyst, it'll go away. But I had actual pain in my right wrist during some point during the run. And when I figured out what it was, it was the fact that everybody or half of the pit would walk in next to my drum set, like right next to me, and quite often kick my cymbal stand. I don't know if this will seem strange or if you can relate to this, but I was on such an automatic way I played, I didn't realize when that would happen. So if someone inadvertently kicks my cymbal stand and just turns it a little bit, it changes your hand approach to the cymbal, And that's what I realized when I realized I need to make sure this is in the same exact spot at the same angle, because I couldn't figure out what it was, and that was it. So once I got it straight and I straightened my wrist out, I didn't twist it to get to the cymbal. I never had another problem, and I am very aware of that ergonomically, because as a drummer, it's very common to get back problems. I think lower back problems, especially if you're sitting on a drum stool without a back on it. Which now there are. It's more common to see those backs on the stools, but you really can't play that way. It's only good for in between. And I wound up getting one of those at Cats because, you could still slouch very easily. And I wanted to make sure my posture was good. So that was something first, I think, that made me very aware of ergonomics and that thing with my wrist. But after that, nothing. I could practice 8 hours a day. I could play the same show. Everything was great. And that was the one incident regarding playing that I had with my hands. Haven't had anything before or after.
Speaking of gear, what kind of gear do you use?
It's funny because in this today, now, you so rarely need drums, even when you play in clubs. You certainly don't need them in shows. You need to have a set for your gigs, your outside gigs. And so I'm not that fussy about stuff because I don't get to use it that often. I'll buy a new kit and then I realize I played it a handful of times and I want to try something else, but I'm not playing my own stuff other than cymbals. I'm sort of, very aware of that because I'll always bring those to gigs. But I'm into small drums, always was, always into a 4-piece kit. With Frankie Valli, I expanded to a 22-inch bass and, a rack of toms. But generally, I'm a 4-piece kit person. And for practicalities in the city, lately I've been using a nesting kit that Maxwell's makes, which is where I teach, and they have a nice nesting kit that is great. It's a little small on the bass drum because it's a 16-inch where you can use a lifter, but with that lifter, it feels like an 18 or a 20 because it's not sitting on the floor. You get the whole drum off, and you can still tune it down a little bit. So I don't mind that for a lot of the gigs I'm playing. But other than that, I'll use. I have a snare drums will mix. I have a nice Craviato snare. I have. I'll always seem to go back to the Ludwig 400, that classic, metal framed 5.5-inch drum. That's just fine for me. So I guess in that sense, I'm not too gear oriented. you know. And if I were recording more now, I think I'd be more aware of that, more aware of the different heads and all the different things that you can do now. But I'm an as needed kind of a person when it comes to, you know, getting something new. If I see something and I go, oh wow, I don't have that, I'll add that to my stuff, but not too fussy about that.
Speaking of adding things, back in the 70s, did you ever have a drum set with an 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, and 20-inch toms and a 24-inch bass? Were you ever that kind of drummer?
I thought you were naming one of my sets there, because I had a sling, and I had an endorsement with Sling On once, and I had an 8, 10, 12, 14, and then I had 2 different bass drums. So I had a 22 for rock stuff, and I had a 20 because, again, that was my size. I was more comfortable with it. And but I didn't go into the real big, like the double floor tom things. No, okay. That configuration was enough if I needed that sweeping tom sound. And the rest of it's just too big. You know, I didn't have a truck. I didn't want to carry all that stuff around.
Did you take the bottom heads off of the toms?
I did in the 70s because that was a popular thing to do, and which is why all those, you know, if you listen to recordings from the 70s, they sound very boxy, because that's what they were. It was a loose head with tape on it and no bottom, and go.
I think I remember my first drum set was a Slingerland, and I used to put, I think they were called dead ringers on the toms. Maybe it's on the bottom of the heads. I forgot what I did, but yeah, that sound, so weird. I remember just looking at my drums, and they were made with bottom heads on them, but I took the bottoms off. It's like so weird to think back. But did you ever have North drums? I don't know if you remember those drums. They were like
I didn't own a set, but I did a record using the North toms.
Really?
It's funny because I listened to it recently. It was never reissued in CD, and I didn't realize this, but I'm looking back at my limited discography, you know, and my favorite records, none of them came out after vinyl, or, you know, other than vinyl. So you can't find, they're very hard to find. So the Frankie Valli album, I don't think came out CD. It's come out, and they've split it up, taken certain songs and used them in compilations with other things. But the original album was never released in CD form, at least not that I know.
What was it called?
Frankie Valli Is the Word. So it had Grease on it, but Grease was on the Grease, you know, the Saturday Night Fever album. So who wanted that song again? So the album sold, you know, like 20 copies, and it took a year to put it out anyway. So it was good. It was well done. It was interesting to work with Bob Gaudio, who was the genius behind all of those Four Seasons tracks, and very unusual, very California working style, you know, very low key. We just went in the studio all day long. Nothing was written down, and he just wanted to experiment, you know, because he could afford to do that with the way he had the tracks and the way he wanted the drums played, you know. No, I don't want a backbeat on 2 and 4. I want to, you know, give me a snare on 2, and then I want and 4 and on 2 toms, and I want it in this order. You know what I mean? So he would experiment with that sort of thing, because again, they're always looking for that unique groove, that unique little approach to something.
So you were the drummer on this album. I'm just looking it up right now. Frankie Valli Is the Word, right?
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I don't even know what the title was, because is it Grease is the word? It's like it says Valley ... is the word. Yeah.
So Grease is on this. You played on that song.
No, I didn't. So that was recorded by the Bee Gees. Did that? That's
okay.
So that was their thing, and he sang on that, and they let him put that on his album. And it didn't help the sales, because as I said, everyone already had bought that song, and no one, after the summer of Grease, no one wanted to ever hear that song again.
But you played on Needing You, Sometimes Love Songs Make Me Cry, Without Your Love Over Me, Save Me, Save Me. Do you remember any of these songs?
A little bit, yep. And one of them, my favorites are when, what they put on top of them. So there's one of those songs you just mentioned, has a great solo by Hubert Laws that they brought in. And I'm going, oh man, I'd love to have been there to hear that. There's another record I did with a singer who's still around named Marty Lebus, Lebous. She spells it now Marty LeBeau because people had trouble pronouncing it Lebous. She has a band called the Martes. They play around town, a lot of great studio players and people of, my generation back then that are doing stuff. But she had an album when she was 18 that was produced by Charlie Colello. And they had, it seemed, an unlimited budget because the Brecker brothers were on it. Will Lee was playing bass. There were strings, there were horns. And that's the album I did use my North drums on. And that's called Lady Wants to Be a Star by Marty Lebus. And if you can ever find that, I think it still reads great. And there's a killer Mike Brecker solo on that. And it was a fun record because although Charlie Colello was a great arranger, and I was very young, he let me play. He said, nah, go for it. I'll tell you when it's too much. So it was very relaxed sounding and fun to play. Whereas, you know what those dates are like when you go in and they want just this particular thing and don't do anything else. And, but I just remember that as a great experience and playing with those players, man, that was such a treat.
Hey, I'm just looking it up on YouTube. I can't wait to hear this.
It might be hard to find. There's one song I know was reissued. It's called For David. You might find it under that because someone picked it up and re-released it in an album of a compilation of background singers, that you don't know of or something like that. But the song For David is one of the tunes I love, and it's about her brother. There we go. Yeah. So it's on that record, whatever that record is.
It says two ladies.
Solo on that.
Two ladies too slow to disco.
Yeah. So that was the theme. That was the theme for that compilation, and they just picked off one of the songs from her album for that. That's the only way I can find it because, as I said, that was '76, and it was just vinyl, no cassette, no CD. No re-release, and I'm going, man, that's it.
Going back in time.
Yep.
The 70s, 80s in New York City, were you part of Radio Registry as well?
Yes. And I came to New York, as I said, in 1970. The first thing I did was I went to join Registry. Not that anyone was going to call me, but I figured I was told you got to be on there because that's where the studio work was. And ironically, what was pretty cool, I had met the owner when I was signing up, and he took a liking to me, and you could tell I was young, and he just assumed I wasn't working. So he says, would you like to come in here and work as an operator for, 1 or 2 days a week? And you'd learn who the contractors were and who the players were. And I thought, well, that's a good idea. Actually, I didn't want to do it. I thought, maybe that's a good idea. And I'm, in hindsight, that was such a cool opening for me because I really right away learned who was working, where the studios were, how the whole system worked, and it was a great learning experience.
Ray Marchica told me about how all of that worked. It was 212JU. What is it again?
JU2 8800.
Yeah,
I still have a couple of trap cases with that imprinted on the logo, and I realize I'm sort of embarrassed sometimes to have someone see my name and this phone number with these 2 letters in it, and they, because I'm thinking this guy must be 100 years old. What's he doing with those? But the other thing was in the 70s, the recording studios, especially the jingle houses, you had to bring your own trap case. Weird thing. They had the bass and the toms, maybe snare drum, I don't know. But every drummer who's doing jingles for certain studios, not all of them, but the ones that were jingles, made you bring your own trap case. So your cymbals and stands, a weird thing. Yeah, very, very weird. It faded fairly quickly, but there were the busy studio guys had probably 2 and 3 sets of trap cases that were there was a delivery service, and you would book them and say, okay, at 4:00 tomorrow, I need this trap case at Associated, and then the next morning I need it over at A&R, and for a date. And at Registry, when I was working there as an operator, this is what you saw, how busy and crazy things were in the music business, because there were literally, hundreds of dates every day.
Really?
That you weren't playing on, but maybe not hundreds, but it felt like hundreds when you were busy and the phone's ringing like crazy. There's 8 lines, and you're literally booking session after session after session. Not all records, by the way. I mean, most of these were jingles, and probably most of them were demos. So if you think back now, everyone does a demo in their house, right? And they can make a great track. Back then, every ad that was going to be run or competed to get on television or radio, they had to have a demo for it. And most times they'd hire at least a rhythm section to play for those. Many times the rhythm section would be hired, and they'd bring in 4 or 5 songwriters, and they would pass out their tune, their version of this product, whatever you're promoting. Okay. So you're singing about soap and we're basically playing the track. They'd take their music, thank you very much. They'd leave, the next songwriter would come in and give you their chart, and you'd play this next 60-second spot. That was one way of doing it. If one of those went final, they would now call you back in. They'd probably hire an arranger and maybe enlarge the size of the band, and you would do the jingle as a final. After the final is done, they could cut it into, you might do a 30-second and a 60-second. And 3 months later, you go to the union and you'd pick up a check of stacks like you just hit the lotto. Where'd all these checks come from? Well, the residuals, because in different parts of the country, it would be done differently, or they would put a different voiceover on it, and you'd get paid for that. If they re-recorded it in Spanish for Puerto Rico, you'd get paid for that. A residual rate, so we're talking $30, and they could run it for 13 weeks. But again, jingles paid, less than $100 an hour, but that 1 hour could run, you could be making money from that for years. So it was a very lucrative part of the business. And again, when people say, well, how interested were you in Broadway? Well, not very, because, this is where the gold was, and it was fun because you're in and out. And I never did enough that I got tired of that, because you're playing with great players. The challenge was, can I nail it right away? Can I be with the click? And then you're out the door, no pressure, no 2.5 hours, no notes. It was either good or bad. And if it was struck gold, you'd come in and do it again. And, it was a great payday.
I'm shaking my head here because I'm thinking about, you had the arrangers, you had the copyists, you had the musicians, you had the engineers, you had the producers, you had the studios, you had the cartage people, you had the instrument makers, you had the music stores. Everyone's making money, and it was a massive industry, and the ecosystem was huge. And again, I understand things change, just like when the drums, like you said earlier, the drum machine came out, you had to learn to adapt. I know people like Jimmy Braylauer is his name,
Braylauer, yeah.
And Sammy Marandino adapted to it, and they made a whole bunch of money. Sammy was telling me that he's like, yeah, I can't go on tour with you, Cameo, because I'm making the same amount you're going to be paying me for a week. I can make that during the day, one day, probably 1 hour. Yeah. So yeah, you have to adjust. And today, we're doing a podcast using technology, and people have to adjust. I'm kind of shaking my head that looking at Broadway and how the ecosystem for Broadway is just as huge. You have the wardrobe, you have the the detergent that you have to use to clean the wardrobe or to go to the dry cleaner. And they got to get paid. And you have the restaurants around from people that come in. You got people delivering stuff to the actors. And of course, you have the sound and the lights and the ushers. And there's a lot of money to be made. I just hope it returns back to 2019 levels because everything was pretty nice.
Yes.
And I hope that the young drummers that come in get the same opportunities that we had because it was nice. I think it's going to get back there again. And,
I do too. And it's probably going to morph a little bit. It'll be a little different than it was, and as time always does to things. But
yes,
there are so many new opportunities for the next generations. They do things differently than the way we learned it. So that's the other hope that I always have is that they'll find a new way to do it. I mean, I'm hearing a lot about NFTs, and there's a website now that is establishing a collaborative co-ownership of an NFT of your music. So using the blockchain and all the crypto stuff, but this could be the future. I mean, this is maybe the way you market your music. I had to worry about, going out and doing showcases for record companies, hoping they would sign you and give you an advance. And then, you're going into the studio and record it. Now you record it in your home, you have someone shoot a little video, and you make an NFT and you put it on TikTok and boom, you're viral. So I think the younger generation understands that stuff, and it will be organic for them to take what we did as a foundation and move it forward to where I won't even know what they're talking about.
One thing, though, I got to say that seems to have been carried over from the prehistoric days is that choreographers still want to hear drums. When I do workshops or, when you're doing, the beginning of a new show, they want you in the room because they have to dance to something. And dancing to a musical director's foot stomping on the floor isn't good enough. So they still want the acoustic drums, or if they're going to have electric drums, they still want to hear an actual drummer. So thankfully, we can still work, and you still have to know how to play and use your hands.
I agree. There's hope. We'll have to hit something for thousands of years to come because we've been, our ancestors have been doing it since the beginning, Yeah. So in some form, it will continue. I agree.
Yes. Well, on that note of positivity.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Clayton. Enjoyed it.
Head over to the Broadway Drumming 101 YouTube page where you'll find unedited conversations that I've had with some of your favorite musicians. On the YouTube page, you're going to find bonus content that I don't feature on my Instagram page or here on the podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell at the top so that you'll be notified when a new video is uploaded. Thank you for listening and stay tuned for more.